then they're going to have to explain that to Rob and Alan and Dallas and millions of families and business owners just like them. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I ask consent to enter into a colloquy with my Republican colleagues.
Without objection.
I thank the President. The senator from Washington said that Republicans often change the subject. That's exactly what we intend to do. We intend to change the subject from raising taxes to creating jobs. And in terms of taxes, according to the Congressional Budget Office report recently, this is hard to believe. You have to go back and read it again, but 20% of Americans who pay individual taxes pay 94% of all the taxes. 20% of Americans pay 94% of the taxes. And the President and his allies are about the only ones in the country right now who are going out across the country and say the way to solve this 5 years of recession and bad economy that we've experienced is to raise taxes on the people who create millions of jobs. That's their argument, that the way to deal with the bad economy we're in is to raise taxes on the people who create millions of jobs. We don't believe that. We're prepared to keep the tax rates where they are while we deal with what we need to deal with, which is the fiscal cliff that the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board talks about, which he says if we do not deal with at the end of the year will produce, according to the Congressional Budget Office as well, a recession in the first 6 months of 2013, more loss of jobs. So the subject we're here to talk about this morning is how to avoid that, and the question we're going to ask is why not bring up the appropriations bills and do our job under the Constitution to limit spending and get a head start on the business of putting the fiscal problems we have behind us. Nothing could create jobs more rapidly than for us to bring Washington into some solvency, create some certainty. People have said, we're not going to invest, we're not going to hire until we see whether Congress can act. And as far as the appropriations bills, here are the basics. We have 12 of them that we pass every year. A bipartisan group of us went to the floor a few months ago and praised the majority leader and the Republican leader for their agreement to try to bring them to the floor and pass them. That's only happened twice in 12 years. And so we worked hard to do that. 9 of the 12 appropriations bills are ready for the Senate to consider. In other words, they've been all the way through the process. They're ready for the Senate to consider. Only the majority leader can bring them to the floor. Yet he said 2 weeks ago suddenly, no appropriations bills this year. That's 38% of the budget. That's more than $1 trillion. That's our job to do. It's the way we control spending. Yet we're not even going to deal with it, Mr. President. So this morning we're going to talk about the consequences of that and hope that the majority leader will change his mind, bring these bills to the floor. The House is doing its job. 11 of their 12 bills are ready for House action, and the House has passed 6. And while they may be at a different overall spending level than we are, we have a well-established procedure for dealing with that called the conference, which is the way we normally deal with differences between the two houses. So suddenly we're saying no budget, no appropriations bills. That's why we're on the floor today. I'd like to begin by asking the senator from Georgia, who is a former leader of the Republicans in the Georgia legislature and who's been here for a number of years and who's been one of the leaders in this body of working across party lines to try to cause the Senate to do its job, whether he can think of a good reason why we shouldn't be dealing with appropriations bills this year.
I thank Senator Alexander for the recognition and for joining with Senator Blunt in this colloquy. And as I was listening to you talk, I thought back to what happened in my family Sunday night, and I want to start my remarks with that. My wife, Diane, and I went to my son, Kevin, and his wife, Catherine's house to cook out hamburgers on Sunday night. 3 of my 9 grandchildren were there, Elizabeth, Sarah, Catherine, and William. Elizabeth had arrived late, by the way, because she had been at a birthday party, the theme of which was dressing their American Girl dolls. So when Elizabeth finally got home, she sat down by me and she said, "Grandpa, I want to talk to you," or she calls me Pops. "I want to talk to you about my American Girl doll and some accessories that I want to buy." And so she went over with me how much money it would take to buy the accessories and how much money she made for her chores. And so we sat down and kind of budgeted how many chores it's going to take to make the amount of money she needs to buy the American Girl doll. Riding home that night, I commented to my wife, you know, I just spent more time talking about budgeting and appropriating with my granddaughter than I've spent the entire year in the United States Senate. This morning I was with Bud Peterson, the president of the Georgia Institute of Technology, and you can identify this as the former president of the University of Tennessee, and Senator Blunt, the former president of Southwest Baptist University. He was talking about how tuition hasn't really gone up that much, but the amount of state support to subsidize tuition has gone down because the states are having to live within their means, having to have balanced budgets. They're having to cut. And I thought to myself, here we are in Washington, the leaders of the country, the people who should be setting the example, yet my state and my granddaughter are doing a better job than we are. Now, that's an indictment of the system, and I joined with you when we commended Senator Reid on saying that he was going to bring appropriation bills to the floor, and I will come to the floor and cheer him again if he will bring them to the floor. We're running out of time, but we're also running out of the patience of the American people. And Senator Alexander's remarks about jobs, appropriations are all about jobs. Right now, we're operating for the third year in a row under what's known as continuing resolutions. You know what that means? That means we're continuing to do things just as badly as we did the year before because we're not facing the music. We're not prioritizing our expenditures. We're not talking about the appropriations of the American people and their tax dollars. Senator Murray was talking about taxes as one part of the equation. It's only one part. Spending is the other part of the equation, and you only address spending by taking up appropriation bills, by having debate, and by moving forward. Just by way of example, in my state's having a referendum in 2 weeks, a referendum on a $7.4 billion increase in sales tax dedicated for 10 years to roads and improvements in infrastructure, because our state needs it, and the taxpayers are going to vote on it. President Obama just announced a couple of weeks ago a prioritization of the Port of Savannah in Georgia in terms of finishing the deepening and the widening of that project so the Panamax ships can come in. But if we're not doing appropriations bills on WRDA, we're not doing appropriations bills on the Corps of Engineers, we're not doing appropriations bills on highways, those jobs aren't going to come. Or we're going to not have the jobs and the velocity of investment that we need to have. It's a real indictment of the greatest democracy on the face of this earth, the leader of the entire free world, that at a time when we're in difficulties, we're in a time with increased debt, we're in a time of great challenges, we're talking more with our grandchildren about spending and saving than we're talking to each other about the money of the taxpayers of the United States of America. So I commend the senator from Tennessee and the senator from Missouri on their dedication to this subject and the leadership he's shown on appropriation in subcommittee work. Senator Cochran, all the members of the Appropriations Committee, the bills are ready. All it takes is for somebody to drop the flag and say, bring them to the floor. I hope Senator Reid will reconsider not bringing them to the floor and instead bring them to the floor. Let us talk about the American people's money. Let's talk about jobs. Let's talk about investment in the greatest country on the face of this earth. And I yield back to the Senator from Tennessee.
Well, I thank the senator from Georgia for his clear statement about how solving the appropriations problem, solving the fiscal problems, create an environment in which the private sector in this country is willing to create more jobs. And how failing to do that would create, in the words of the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, would be destructive, and in the estimate of the Congressional Budget Office would create a recession in the first 12 months of 2013. Now, the senator from Missouri is a former number 2 leader in the House of Representatives, and now he's a part of the Senate Republican leadership. So he has some special knowledge about how the two houses work together. The majority leader gave as his reason why he couldn't bring up the appropriations bill, one, that it didn't fit the Budget Control Act. Well, one of the Budget Control Act, which we passed, I voted for it, set a limit on appropriations, and the Senate is marking up our bills to that number. The House is marking up to a number a little below. And the majority leader said, well, they're at one number, the Senate's at another number, so we just won't do anything. But I would ask the senator from Missouri, I thought it was a pretty normal procedure for the House of Representatives to do what it thought it ought to do and the Senate to do what it thought it ought to do, and that there's something called a conference of the Senate and the House to work out the differences.
Well, that's exactly right, that's the way the process is supposed to work. And I think the observation you made on the Budget Control Act is that's the maximum amount of money we agree to spend The majority leader's view is, well, if the House decides to spend less than that, somehow we just can't move forward. Now, the truth is that's the excuse for this year. In the 6 years that the current majorities controlled the Senate, they haven't passed a budget 3 times, and 3 times haven't brought a single appropriations bill to the floor. I don't know exactly what the excuse was the other times, but this year it's, well, the House has a different number. The House is a different institution. It's the House of Representatives. They get elected every 2 years. They bring bills to the floor. In fact, they've had a budget the last 2 years, and we haven't. I think the House the last year that the other majority controlled, the last year that Nancy Pelosi was Speaker, didn't have a budget. That may be the only time ever since the Budget Control Act that the House didn't have a budget. But the Senate, I mean, since the budget law in 1974, but the Senate hasn't had a budget for 3 years. You know, there's that old saying, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And clearly, the budget's a plan. And the parliamentarian says we don't have one. The parliamentarian says that the Senate has failed to obey the law for 3 years now because we don't have a budget. We're not prepared to tell the American people what our budget is. And even in spite of not having a budget, the Senate Appropriations Committee has gone ahead and figured out a number that they could use as the number to appropriate to, and those bills are ready. The only problem is those bills aren't allowed to come to the floor. And just a few days ago, I can't remember what the waste of time of that week was on the Senate floor, but I said in the leadership stakeout, why aren't we doing the things that we're supposed to be doing that give us a plan, that tell the American people what we're for, and then at the next moment, the next press opportunity, the majority comes out and they ask the leader, why aren't we doing that? And the majority leader says, well, because the House has a different number, so we're not going to we're not going to have an appropriations process until the election is over. Now, it's particularly interesting to me, Senator Alexander, that the majority's view is that they don't want to tell people until the election is over what they're for. The House is saying what they're for. They've had 11 bills of the 12 ready to go to the floor. More than half of them have been voted on. They voted on a budget. But in the Senate of the United States, we're not prepared to tell people what we're for. And another thing that and this is 38% of the budget. You mentioned this earlier. What about the other 62%? The other 62% now gets spent if we don't even show up, if nobody takes any action, because we've already defined the so-called entitlement part of the budget, which is a lot of that's Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, 62%. And by the way, that was all of the money that came in. And while we've not had a budget for 3 years, while over 6 years we've only brought appropriations bills to the floor 3 times, our national debt has nearly doubled. It went from $8.67 trillion when the current majority leader became the majority leader to $15.87 trillion now, 6 years later. We've doubled the debt. We have failed to plan, which I guess the old adage is true. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And our big failure is we've allowed the debt of the country, the debt that was accumulated in over 200 years, we've now doubled in 6 years. And during that 6 years, we have just simply been unwilling to do our work. The American people are upset about what's happening in Washington, and they should be. I'm upset about it, too. And we could be talking about spending on the floor of the Senate, and that's the only way to ever get spending under control. And the appropriations bills, the most basic work that the Congress is supposed to do. And by the way, we ought to get to where we're talking about more than 38% of the budget when we talk about the appropriations bills. We have to get that back in the right category as well. But we've got to make the Senate work. The best way to do that is to do the job that the Congress is supposed to do, the House and the Senate. And when only the House does it, there's no chance to have that conference that, that's how legislation works, back to your original point. The House passes a bill. Any of us that had the basic civic course remember how that chart looked. The House passes a bill, the Senate passes a bill, then you go to conference and talk about the differences. But the current majority is saying, well, if there are differences, we could never work that out, so we just won't do our part of the legislative process. We just won't have the debate in the Senate. We won't tell the American people what we're for, and we'll let them go to the polling place on Election Day guessing if they want to what we might be for, but we're certainly not going to let them find that out by bringing legislation to the floor. The Senate's not doing its work. This is the fundamental work that needs to be done. I mean, imagine when you were the governor of Tennessee or when you were the president of the University of Tennessee, if you just decided we're not going to have a budget, or this interesting argument that some of our colleagues make that the Budget Control Act is the budget because it sets the top line. That would be like when you were governor, Senator Alexander, if you'd gotten your advisor and your cabinet together and said, okay, here's the amount of money we're going to spend, now let's just see how it works out. That would be the budget? Of course that wouldn't be the budget, and it would be a disaster, and the 6-year deficit numbers of $8.67 trillion to now 6 years later $15.87 trillion, that proves that the disaster truly has happened, and I just can't imagine. Your thoughts, how would you possibly have run a state or run a university or run a business if your budgeting process was, here's the top number we're going to spend, now let's go and see how it works out?
Well, I can't imagine how that would be. In fact, this is such a breathtaking assertion by the majority leader, it's hard to grasp it. I mean, here we are in a fiscal mess. I mean, everybody says that. Now, they'll say it's for a different reason on that side than we do, but everybody acknowledges that. Everybody acknowledges as well that while the rest of the world's in trouble, we're just in a little less trouble, and that we can get out of our trouble more easily than the rest of the world, and that the whole, not the whole, but the single biggest decision about whether the United States deals with its fiscal crisis and gets the economy moving again is whether the President and the Congress can govern. That's what everyone says, and we know that it's true. So in other words, this isn't out of our hands. This isn't out of our control. In fact, it is within our hands. All we have to do is come to some agreement about how much money we can spend, reform the taxes, reduce the debt, control entitlement spending, and this country will take off like a rocket. The retiring head of the World Bank last month told a briefing of about 35 Democratic and Republican senators, all of whom are concerned about this, all of whom are committed to working on it, that people who are making decisions about whether to hire people or whether to invest more money in the United States have stopped. They've stopped because of the uncertainty. And what are they waiting on? They're waiting to see whether we can function. They're waiting to see whether we can govern. They've stopped to wait to see. This is not an encouraging indication about whether the United States can govern. We had some encouragement earlier in the year. That's why we came to the floor, several of us, on both sides of the aisle, complimented the majority leader, complimented the Republican leader, and said, we applaud your agreement to do the appropriations bills. It says right here in the Constitution, Section 8 of Section 9 of Article 1, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. In other words, this is our job in Article 1. People say I use the Grand Ole Opry as an analogy too often sometimes, but, you know, why would you join the Grand Ole Opry if you didn't want to sing? I mean, appropriating money is what we do. If you don't like the Solyndra loan, then I'm supposed to come up here and make that argument if I agree with that. If Senator Blunt has a flood problem out in Missouri, he can make the argument that he made last year. Put some more money in to take care of the flood victims, take some more money out of here to pay for it. or if we want less of this or more of that. The way we do that is going through the appropriations process, coming to the floor, offering amendments, representing the people who elect us and send us here. What are we supposed to say when we go home and they say, well, we think there should be more money for the Caney Fork River Dam or more money for the levees down along the Mississippi, and there ought to be less money for loans like Solyndra? Are we supposed to say, well, sorry, we're not in business in the Senate? Because the one person who can put an appropriations bill on the floor has announced suddenly that he's not going to do it. It's not because we don't have time to do it. Look here. Here we are. We could be doing it today. I'll bet we don't even have a vote today, much less debate something interesting. We've been wasting the entire month. We could have taken up every one, almost every one, most of the 9 appropriations bills that are ready to be enacted and put them on the floor to vote. I would say to the Republican senator from Missouri, you're a part of the Republican leadership. You have that honor. And there's a different way to run the United States Senate. I mean, and maybe that should be a major factor in the election this year. Maybe people who would like to see the Senate work on the $1 trillion that's a part of the appropriations bills, bring bills to the floor in a bipartisan way, let senators from every state vote on those, vote them up or down. That would be one way to run the United States Senate. And I wonder if that kind of discussion has been going on in the Republican leadership about how, if we were fortunate enough to have a majority, move a few desks from that side over to this side as a result of the election, how do you think that Senator McConnell and the Republican leadership would conduct business in the Senate?
Well, I do think that we're having that discussion, and, you know, particularly about the budget. There have never been 60 popularly elected Republican senators, so anytime Republicans controlled the Senate, it was with a number that was below 60, and the budget became incredibly important because you can do things that involve spending money or collecting money during the 10-year budget window, during a decade, and that decade can be extended every single year if you want it to, so you can always be talking 10 years in the future of solid policy. And by the way, in a democracy, 10 years of knowing what the policy is a lot of time. We'd have to have a budget. Our friends in the majority now, there are 53 of them. They could do anything in the budget, or at least set out to do, anything in the budget that 53 of them said they wanted to do. They could change tax policy for 10 years if 53 of them wanted to do it. They could change how we implement the President's health care bill if 53 of them wanted to do it, because that's spending money, and we would have to do that. I don't think there's any doubt that if our side was in the majority, we would have a budget because, frankly, it's the biggest tool that our size majorities ever had. There have never been 60 of us. We couldn't rely on 60 for everything.
Senator, would you permit? I've heard Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, speak, and both in our Republican caucus and in meetings with Democrats in committee and publicly. And I believe he has made it absolutely clear that if he were fortunate enough to be the majority leader, that he'd bring appropriations bills to the floor and that he'd see that a large number of amendments from both sides of the aisle were offered, and that we would be working longer, working later, getting more done.
I think he's made that, I think you're exactly right. He's made that pledge at press conferences. I think some of that's been said recently on the floor here of the Senate. Let's get our work done, and if we were in the majority, we would pledge we would get our work done. Now, that means that Republican senators and Democrat senators would wind up having to take some votes that they just as soon not take. But that's always been part of being in the Senate, that you're here to say what you're for. And you're here for 6 years to say what you're for. The last 6 years, if you'd served in the Senate, your only time in the Senate, as it would be the case for some of our colleagues up to now, has been the last 6 years, you've really never had a chance to say what you're for. Half the years, you didn't even have an appropriations bill on the floor. And, you know, we've added to the legislative dialogue normal phrases that didn't used to be quite as normal, like the continuing resolution. And what's the continuing resolution? That means you basically can't get your work done for the next year, so you're just going to decide to put a couple of Band-Aids on whatever was the rules for last year and move forward. When you talk about continuing resolution, that's a failure. And when we come back in September, we're going to have a few more days here in July, early August. Then, as Congress has always done, we'll go home and hear a lot of complaints in August this year because we're not getting our work done. We're going to come back in September. The fiscal year, the spending year ends the end of September, and what are our choices going to be? We're not going to have good choices. We've had no appropriations bills, so the choice is to either let the government stop functioning on October 1 or continue spending money at the level that we decided who knows how many years ago to spend that money in many of these programs, because we've really not talked about these programs. So we go from no good choice to an even a worse choice.
I would ask the senator from Missouri what makes this especially disappointing. We're all good friends here. I mean, people sometimes talk about lack of civility in the Senate. The fact is, the Senate's probably the most civil place in the United States. We're excessively nice to each other. We have disagreements, but we're nice to each other. But what's disappointing is it's not functioning. The Senate is not functioning like it's supposed to do. It would be as if the President announced, well, I'm not going to the office for a month or two. Or if the Supreme Court said, well, it's gotten to be February and we think we'll stop deciding cases and go home. We'll go on vacation. What would the American people say? Well, that's what's happening here. And it's not that we don't have the time. We have it right now. We have it this minute that we could be doing it. And what makes it especially disappointing was that earlier this year there was what I would call an outbreak of good government. I mean, we had the majority leader and the Republican leader saying, okay, let's bring all the appropriations bills to the floor, and people on both sides applauding them. And then we had some discussions, and lo and behold, suddenly we had bills coming to the floor that made a difference in the lives of Americans. The FAA, which is about airline safety, and the Farm Bill, and the Highway Bill, and the Postal Service Bill. And thanks to suggestions by the senator from Michigan, Senator Levin and others, we began to adopt an agreement that let's allow all relevant amendments to the bill. So we began to vote a lot. One of those bills had 73 votes, I think. And then there were even some amendments that weren't relevant. It began to look like the time in the 1980s when Senator Byrd and Baker ran the Senate, and Senator Byrd or Baker would come to the floor and say, all right, here's a bill that's supported by the Democratic chairman and the ranking Republican, or vice versa. They'd put it on the floor, they'd ask for amendments, they might get 300, and then they'd say, I ask unanimous consent to have no more amendments. Of course, they'd get it because everybody who wanted an amendment had offered one, and then they'd start to vote. And then the majority leader would say, okay, we're going to stay till we finish, and they did. Now, it never was perfect. It's always a little messy. That's the way the Senate is. But they got a lot of work done. That's what makes this so disappointing.
Well, it's disappointing in that, as you say, it's not even that hard to figure out what we could be doing or what we should be doing or what's the fundamental work of what we should be doing. There are things that the Constitution says we can't do, like initiate a tax bill. And so we're spending a lot of time on tax bills that even if we passed one would be unconstitutional, and the House would say, because they have the right to start those bills, they'd say, we're not even going to deal with that because it's outside the Constitution. It's not like this is a hard formula. And how do you get spending under control? The number one domestic priority in the country today should be more private sector job creation, but the number one priority for the federal government would be, how do you get spending under control? How do we begin to pay off debt rather than add to debt? And the only way you can do that is debate the spending bills. And once we do that, you mentioned the former head of the World Bank a minute ago. I heard you mention a few days ago, several years ago after you left the governorship, you spent some time in Australia and made good friends there. But one of the former prime ministers of Australia, I'm going to let you tell that story, but everybody in the world knows the best and strongest economy and workforce in the world is ours if we just do the right thing, and the right thing is not that hard to figure out. But you were telling me one of the former prime ministers had just returned to the government after some time away, but I thought his comment about what it takes for our country to reassert itself as the economic place to watch and place to be and place to want to be. If you'd remind me exactly about that story, I thought it was very telling that people all over the world understand what it is we ought to do. We're just not doing it.
I'd be happy to do that, Senator. Actually, Bob Zoellick, the retiring head of the World Bank, reported this story to 35 or 40 of us of both parties who were meeting to find out how we could work together to do what we're talking about, which is to deal with all these fiscal cliff issues that are coming at the end of the year. And he repeated, Bob Carr, the new foreign minister of Australia, saying at a speech here in Washington that the United States is one budget agreement away from reasserting its global preeminence. Now, all of us believe the United States is the preeminent country in the world. But that comes from a great friend of the United States who wants us to succeed and who knows that we can. And that if he knows that if we want to get our economy moving again and help the world get its economy moving again, the main thing we need to do is make this fiscal agreement, deal with the debt, deal with tax reform, deal with the payroll taxes, deal with the sequester, deal with the appropriations bills. This is the single most important thing we can do to get our economy moving again instead of headed into a depression. He put it that way, to reassert, establish, claim, renew, whatever adjective or verb you want to use to maintain America's global preeminence. The way to do that is to get a budget agreement at the end of the year. We're off to such a promising start this year, and now we've slid backwards. So it's my hope, and we'll conclude with this. I'll let the senator from Missouri make the final remarks in the colloquy, but it would be my hope that the majority leader would decide we could use the rest of our time this week and next week to deal with appropriations bills. And then when we come back in September, that we could deal with more. It doesn't take long. Just put them on the floor and let's get to work. We can agree on a reasonable number of amendments. We showed we can do that before. And the American people would appreciate us doing our job. Remember, there are 9 of the 12 ready to go. It affects 38% of the budget. That's more than $1 trillion in spending. That would be one more indication that we're capable of governing ourselves, which is the single most important signal that those who invest and create jobs in America need to see and hear from Washington, D.C. So I thank the senator from Missouri for his leadership, and I thank him for coming to the floor.
You know, my only thought as we're standing here finishing up this discussion is that as people hear this, they're saying, well, now what are Senator Alexander and Senator Blunt? They're just talking about how the federal government can spend the money and that being the most important thing. If you're going to get spending under control, of course it's the most important thing. It's not a desire to spend money. It's a desire to debate how we spend the money. It's a desire to plan how we spend the money. It's a desire to give as much notice as we can to the country, to the states, to people who are trying to make job-creating decisions, that the American government is going to do the right things, that the American government is going to plan for a future that makes sense rather than fail to plan and stumble into a future that continues just to do the wrong things. We've seen the debt of the country almost double now in 6 years. Surely that's enough indication that what we're doing is not working, and more of the same is not the answer. Getting back to the real responsibility of the Senate to do its job. The House is doing its job, and they're going to take some criticism about the programs they said should be cut or redefined. We need to do our job. And that's the way this process has to work. It's disappointing that it's not working. We're going to come back here in all likelihood in September with bad choices that will be made. One is to shut the government down. One is just to somehow continue spending money just like we've been spending it, as the debt of the United States of America doubled in about 6 years. And I'd yield back to my friend from Tennessee.
President, we yield back the remainder of our time, and I notice well, Mr. President, I see the senator from Nebraska here, and would he be willing to be a part of our colloquy? Is he here to make another statement?
Well, I am here to make another statement, but I do want to associate myself with what the two gentlemen have said, the gentleman from Missouri and the gentleman from Tennessee. I look at our assignment between now and the end of the year, and we have some monumental issues to tackle. In fact, so monumental that many are referring to the work that needs to be done or as a fiscal cliff. Some are talking in the vein of we are going to cause another recession unless we come to grips with these issues. And I look at this week and so many weeks that have passed this year and nothing is done. I'm going to guess when this week is all said and done, we will probably take 3 votes. That seems unbelievable for the United States Senate. It doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way at all. We could be addressing the important issues that face our nation. And there isn't any reason why we shouldn't be addressing those issues. Let's debate bills. Let's vote on them. Let's do the right thing for our country. And I thank the two gentlemen for their comments and pleased to be able to associate myself. Mr. President, I would like...
Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like the following comments to be reported separately. Mr. President.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to remember a fallen hero, U.S. Marine Corps Lance Corporal Hunter H.D. Hogan. Lance Corporal Hogan was killed in action while supporting combat operations in Afghanistan on June 23, 2012. Lance Corporal Hogan cultivated a desire to serve our nation at an early age and followed in his father's footsteps when he enlisted in the Marine Corps on October 26, 2009. He, like so many young Marines, could have pursued other opportunities outside of the military, but he instead chose to take an oath of service to our great country. He was rightfully proud of that oath and remained faithful to the mission and to his brothers in arms. The Hogan family laid their Marine to rest in York, Nebraska on July 6, 2012. Lance Corporal Hogan served with honor and valor, having been awarded the Purple Heart, the Combat Action Ribbon, the Sea Service Deployment Ribbon, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, and the National Defense Service Medal. Hunter is mourned by his wife, Brittany, his father, mother, grandparents, and so many others. I know his family is proud of him and will always remember his spirit and his quick wit. His sense of adventure and his enthusiasm for rodeo, hunting, and fishing will also be fondly remembered. Hunter's passion for life and those around him allowed him to be the best Marine that he could be. But strong Marines are not possible without the support of a family. Hunter's family chose a quote by Senator Paul H. Douglas to describe their young Marine's passion for the Corps. Quote, "Those of us who have had the privilege of serving in the Marine Corps value our experience as among the most precious of our lives. The fellowship of shared hardships and dangers in worthy cause creates a close bond of comradeship. It is the basic reason for the cohesiveness of the Marines and for the pride we have in our Corps and our loyalty to each other," unquote. We hold our heads high when we speak of the strong tradition of military service in our great state of Nebraska. We are honored to call him one of our own, and I know that Nebraskans across the state will provide his family with care and love during this very difficult time. May God bless the Hogan family and all of our servicemen and women, both home and abroad. Lance Corporal Hunter Hogan, forever a Marine, forever a cowboy, semper fidelis. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I have 9 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise this morning in strong support of the Middle Class Tax Cut Relief Act that would extend tax cuts for 98% of the American people while letting the Bush tax breaks for the wealthiest 2% expire at the end of this year. Mr. President, I also want to express my strong opposition to the McConnell-Hatch bill that would provide tens of billions of dollars in tax breaks next year to millionaires and billionaires who today are doing phenomenally well. Really, this is not a complicated issue, Mr. President. The United States now is seeing growing wealth and income inequality. The middle class is disappearing. Poverty is increasing. The people on top are doing very, very well at the same time as the effective tax rate of the millionaires and billionaires are the lowest that they have been for many, many decades. This country has a $16 trillion national debt. We have a $1 trillion deficit this year. And to give huge tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires, I believe makes no sense to me, and I believe makes no sense to the American people. Mr. President, our Republican friends have made it very clear that when they say that they don't want to raise taxes on anyone, that's just code for saying they don't want to raise taxes on millionaires and billionaires. I should add that if Governor Mitt Romney becomes president, he has proposed even more tax breaks for the very wealthiest people in this country, while at the same time cutting Social Security, ending Medicare as we know it, and slashing investments in education, transportation, child care, nutrition, and a variety of other programs that benefit working families and the middle class. Mr. President, this morning I want to say a few words about Social Security. And let me be very clear that when we talk about Social Security, it's imperative that we understand that Social Security has not contributed one nickel to our deficit or our national debt. So when people say we have a national debt problem and then we have Social Security and they fuse the two together, that is simply incorrect. As all Americans know, Social Security is independently funded through payroll tax contributions from workers and employers, and up until last year, it has received no funding from the Federal Treasury. Despite the rhetoric that we hear from Republicans and those on Wall Street, Social Security is not in financial crisis. Social Security has a $2.7 trillion surplus. Social Security, according to the Social Security Administration, will be able to pay out 100% of promised benefits to every eligible recipient for the next 21 years. Although the American people now take Social Security for granted, we should never underestimate the incredibly positive impact that Social Security has had on our country. Sometimes we do forget it, especially when those people coming up here and let's cut Social Security, let's cut Social Security. Let's talk about what Social Security has accomplished. Since its inception over 75 years ago, through good economic times and bad, through terrible recessions, Social Security has paid out every nickel owed to every eligible beneficiary with minimal administrative cost. This is an extraordinary accomplishment. Nobody has ever received a letter from the Social Security Administration saying, sorry, we're in the middle of recession, we've had to cut your benefits in half. Every eligible beneficiary has received 100% of the benefits owed to him or her. During this 75-year period, Social Security has succeeded in keeping millions of senior citizens, widows, orphans, and persons with disability out of poverty. Before Social Security existed, almost half of America's senior citizens lived in poverty. Today, that number is too high, but it is 10%, not 50%. Mr. President, more than 55 million Americans now receive Social Security benefits. I would contrast that record to the situation we recently saw on Wall Street when millions of Americans lost significant or all of their retirement savings because of the collapse of Wall Street and the financial crisis that we went through. But, Mr. President, despite this success, despite this incredibly strong record, my Republican friends and too many Democratic friends are calling for cuts in Social Security. For example, we know where Mitt Romney stands on Social Security. Mr. Romney wants to begin the process of privatizing Social Security. I disagree with him because I think that would benefit primarily his friends on Wall Street. Because if you privatize Social Security, where are people going to get their retirement benefits? From Wall Street, and those guys on Wall Street will end up making huge amounts of money by charging the average American a significant commission for their service. Mr. Romney wants to gradually increase the retirement age to 68 or 69. I don't agree with that. At a time when 23 million Americans remain unemployed or underemployed, and when the long-term unemployment for senior citizens is skyrocketing, you tell me, how many employers out there are going to say to a 68-year-old person or a 69-year-old person, we've got a great job for you, especially if you're in the construction trades, or if you're a nurse, or if you're somebody who stands on your feet 8 or 9 hours a day, a waiter or a waitress. I don't think those jobs are going to be there if we raise Social Security retirement age. I don't know what those folks are going to be doing for income. Finally, Mr. President, the Romney campaign has put on his website the following, and I quote, Mitt believes that Social Security benefits should continue to grow, but that the growth rate should be lower for those with higher incomes, end of quote. Well, what does that mean in English? While Mr. Romney has been somewhat vague about his intentions and has not spelled out the exact details of this proposal, some of my Republican friends in the Senate have provided what I believe is the roadmap that Mr. Romney is talking about. Last year, Senators Lindsey Graham, Rand Paul, and Mike Lee introduced a bill that would, among other things, reduce the future growth rate of Social Security benefits for the top 60% of earners, 60% of earners, by establishing what they call a quote-unquote progressive price index. Who are these so-called higher income individuals that my Republican friends are talking about? Under this Republican bill, a worker making about $45,000 a year today, retiring in 2050, would receive 32% less in annual Social Security benefits than under the current formula. How much is a 32% cut for this middle-class wage earner? It's about $7,500 a year. And that, my friends, is a lot of money for a retiree. Mr. President, it should come as no surprise that Republicans in Washington and Governor Romney want to slash Social Security. The truth is Republicans have never liked Social Security, and they have been attacking Social Security since its inception. That is not news. The question, however, that millions of Americans are asking themselves today is where President Obama stands on Social Security. Unfortunately, he has been largely silent on this issue since he has been in the White House and during the current 2012 campaign. He made a very strong statement recently, incorrectly attacking the Republican proposal, the so-called Ryan proposal, to move Medicare toward a voucher program. But unless I'm mistaken, I did not hear a word from him on the future of Social Security. And that is a shame. That is a shame because candidate Barack Obama, when he was running for president in 2008, made it very clear to the American people that he would be a strong defender of Social Security. So let me remind the American people exactly what Barack Obama said on the campaign trail in 2008. On September 6, 2008, Barack Obama told the AARP the following, and I quote, "John McCain's campaign has suggested that the best answer for the growing pressures on Social Security might be to cut cost of living adjustments or raise the retirement age. Let me be clear, I will not do either," end of quote, candidate Senator Barack Obama. On April 16, 2008, Senator Barack Obama said, and I quote, "The alternatives, like raising the retirement age or cutting benefits or raising the payroll tax on everybody, including people making less than $97,000 a year, which today would be $110,000 a year, those are not good policy options," end of quote. On November 11, 2007, candidate Barack Obama said, "I believe that cutting Social Security benefits is not the right answer and that raising the retirement age is not the best option," end of quote. And in order to address the long-term financial challenges of Social Security, candidate Barack Obama came up with an idea that I believe hit the nail on the head. It was exactly the right approach, and I have applauded him for coming up with that idea. What he said is that he would apply the Social Security payroll tax on income above $250,000 a year to make sure that a millionaire and a billionaire pays the same percentage of their income into Social Security as someone who today makes $110,000 a year. Bottom line is you lift the cap on taxable income, billionaires and millionaires above $250,000 a year start contributing into the Social Security Trust Fund. Doing this, and recent reports have confirmed this, would ensure that Social Security would remain solvent for the next 75 years. Mr. President, in 2008, candidate Barack Obama was exactly right. That is the solution to the long-term financial needs of Social Security, and that is why I introduced candidate Obama's concept into legislation. It was the right approach. I've introduced it into legislation, and it now has 10 co-sponsors. Here is how the Economic Times reported on the subject back on June 14, 2008. Quote, "Barack Obama would apply the Social Security payroll tax to all annual incomes above $250,000, which would affect the wealthiest 3% of Americans. The presidential candidate told senior citizens in Ohio that it is unfair for middle-class earners to pay the Social Security tax on every dime they make, while millionaires and billionaires pay it on only a very small percentage of their income," end of quote. That is what Barack Obama said when he was running for president in 2008. I agreed with him. He was very clear. I suspect that millions of Americans voted for Barack Obama because of the strong stand he made in defending Social Security. Unfortunately, since he has been in office, he has been much less clear about his position on Social Security, and there were reports last year that he was considering cutting Social Security as part of a grand bargain with the Speaker of the House, John Boehner. So, Mr. President, what I simply want to know, and I think what the American people want to know, is where does the President stand on Social Security? Is he going to keep faith with the American people? Does he continue to believe what he believed when he ran for president? Is he going to say to the millions and millions of seniors out there who are struggling every single day to keep their heads above water that we are not going to balance the budget on the backs of the elderly and the children and the sick and the poor? That we're not going to continue to give tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires who are doing phenomenally well and cut Social Security as part of some grand bargain when, in fact, Social Security has not contributed a nickel to the deficit situation. Now, Mr. President, as you well know, In terms of Social Security, there's a lot of discussion here in the Senate about moving toward a chained CPI. Now, nobody outside of this room understands what a chained CPI is, but I'll tell you what it is. What it is are significant cuts in Social Security COLAs. And it rests on the theory, if you can believe it, that COLAs for seniors on Social Security are too generous. And when I tell this to people in Vermont, seniors in Vermont, I say, please, don't laugh. But they always laugh. They say, Bernie, in the last 2 out of 3 years, while our health care costs have been going up, while prescription drugs costs have been going up, last 2 out of 3 years, we haven't gotten a COLA at all. How could they possibly believe that the COLAs, that the formulation for coming up with these COLAs are too generous? But that is what the billionaires and the millionaires want. That's what our Republican friends want, and that is what some Democrats want. They want to come up with a formulation which will cut Social Security benefits so that if you are 65 today, when you become 75, you will receive $500 a year less. And when you are 85 and you're trying to get by on $15,000, $16,000 a year, they're going to cut $1,000 from your Social Security benefits. Well, I think when this country has the most unequal distribution of income and wealth, when the top 1% owns 40% of the wealth of this country, when in the last study that I saw, 93% of all new income in 2010 went to the top 1%. Mr. President, I don't think you balance the budget by cutting Social Security for people who are trying to survive on $14,000 or $15,000 a year. That is not the formulation. That's not the way we should go. So, Mr. President, I want to conclude my remarks by simply saying that I'm going to do everything I can to defend Social Security. I am going to do everything that I can to see that, given the fact that our deficit is largely caused by unpaid wars and tax breaks for the rich and the recession, which was created by Wall Street greed, I'm going to fight any effort to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. But today, I think the American people want to know. We know where the Republicans stand on Social Security. We know where Governor Romney stands on Social Security. Now is the time for the President of the United States to tell us where he stands on Social Security. Is he going to keep faith with the promises that he made in 2008? Is he going to stand with the senior citizens of this country and say, no, we're not going to balance the budget by cutting Social Security? So I look forward to hearing what the President has to say. This is an issue which is enormously important to the seniors, the veterans in the state of Vermont, and I'm going to continue dealing with it. Thank you very much. And with that, Mr. President, I would note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
Senator from New York.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr.